Hi everyone, this is the lecture for Module 11A. Remember way back in the day when we were talking about new modes of transportation and how these created a new kind of style called streamline? Well, I want to just make a transition from what we were talking about before and kind of streamline our progress into the present in this lecture. So one thing I never got to in that previous lecture was how the streamline style actually becomes detached from transportation and starts becoming applied to all kinds of other products. I want to show you a couple quick examples of that so you know what I mean. And we're going to use that as a way of talking about what product styling is, how product styling is different from design, and hopefully this is going to bring us into the present to talk about DIY and maker movement stuff, which is the topic for today. So that is the plan. Okay, so you remember I was showing you some slides of early automobiles and also the kinds of buildings that were built with regard to the automobile. So car dealerships, service stations were actually making use of a very simplified, modernized, kind of streamlined style. You can see that here in the photo of the Alfa Romeo dealership in Paris. And hopefully you can see a little bit of streamlined styling in an Alfa Romeo that was produced around the same time that this dealership was built. So this gives you a sense of the kind of cars that were being sold out of this particular facility. You remember we also talked about the rise of the airship or dirigible or Zeppelin and these sort of massive concrete hangars that were built to house these. Which you can see in this slide. We also talked a little bit about the ocean liner as a sort of technological marvel of the time that was not only influential in ship design and in graphic design, but was actually a model that architects were very interested in making their buildings look like a ship and also function in this very streamlined, stripped down way. So what you start to see is all of these competing modes of transportation actually thinking that what they need to do is emphasize their modernity, emphasize their speed and up-to-date qualities. And they actually use product design to do this. So in this case, you can see the graphic designer Cassandre, who we talked about a little bit in that lecture, trying to create this very up to the minute technological sort of celebration of speed and steel and rail for the company LMS. But actually product designers worked on the physical railroad stock as well to try to create a more up to the minute image for railroads, which of course had been around since the 1850s, 1860s in the United States. So you have Raymond Loewy, for example, and you can see him posing here with this locomotive that he designed using streamlined style to emphasize the qualities of this product that would most appeal to the consumer. And we also talked about Art Deco architecture as really trying to underline these same qualities of modernity in railroad stations. We looked at many examples, but I'm just putting this in to remind you, the Cincinnati Union Terminal. And this also even extends to skyscraper design, which is what we were talking about at the end of the hour long ago. And we were using these as examples of Art Deco style. So Chrysler, of course, was a car manufacturer. He was using these ideas in his cars. This is actually called the Chrysler Airflow. And this was not particularly successful in the marketplace. But you can see this as an example of a more streamlined style that car manufacturers were adopting at this time. But the point I really want to make about this right now is that the visual elements that are being used in this kind of design, in a sense, become a vocabulary of forms. So symmetry, stepping back, geometry, these become the kind of hallmarks of an Art Deco style. And it doesn't really matter whether you're applying those to a skyscraper or to an automobile or to something like a cocktail set, as you can see in this example on the right. So what you see in something like this is a product designer, and Norman Bel Geddes was one of the, almost like a celebrity, I would say, product designer at this time. His works were very sought after. And one of the reasons why I think you can kind of see here, right? So this is actually brass, but he's plating it in chrome. So it has this very industrial aesthetic. It's very shiny. It looks very machine made. And he's emphasizing this kind of sleekness, this kind of mechanical quality. And he's really just applying that to the idea of a cocktail shaker, right? So there's actually no reason functionally why a cocktail shaker needs to be made out of a shiny material rather than an unshiny one. And in fact, if you think about how a cocktail shaker works, you actually hold the shaker and you shake up the drink with the ice to cool it. So what this actually means is that you're going to get fingerprints all over these surfaces. And likewise, when you take a hold of these very sleek chrome cups, your fingerprints are going to be left behind. So you could actually say functionally, this doesn't make a lot of sense, but aesthetically, it's very appealing. And you remember we talked about the fact that cocktails were really coming into vogue in the 1920s and 30s. So you actually see a lot of barware and bar furniture produced at this time. Okay, so what you're looking for when you think about this idea of styling is essentially it's a visual idea. There's some kind of visual element. So here in this staircase, it might be, for example, these round forms, which are almost like these sort of giant ball bearings. And it might be this rounded edge or the emphasis on these concentric circles, right? This isn't really necessary for the function of the staircase. People will go up and down the staircase just the same on this very spectacular Art Deco stairs as they might on a very plain wooden staircase, right? So functionally, it isn't terribly different. From a functional perspective, you do want to have a railing, for example, for safety. But the design of that railing, and clearly a lot of attention is being lavished on the design of this railing, right? To give it this sleek industrial feel. You can see here on the landing, you're sort of spinning around the corner as if you're, in high speed motion here, going up and down these stairs. And this, by the way, is from the former RCA building in Rockefeller Center. Which is considered, one of the major Deco works that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So what's happening here, right, is that you're seeing these forms being applied in a variety of contexts. You're seeing these certain kind of visual elements. So here you see it on a staircase. Here you actually see it on a piece of jewelry. Okay, so as you look at this, right, and it says this is a necklace, but looking at the length of this, it seems like it would have to be a really small choker or possibly a bracelet. Looking at this, you can see that the same ideas are being used, right? So there's a kind of a technological, it almost looks like some kind of an auto part, right? And these repeated forms that are being linked together. This idea, it becomes a visual vocabulary that could be applied to skyscrapers or stairwells or jewelry or what have you. Okay, and that is really what product styling means. It means that the aesthetic is somewhat separable from the function of the piece. It's not really being dictated by the aesthetic. Let me give you another example. This is also an example from the Deco period. Henry Dreyfuss, who's another one of these very productive, very well-paid industrial designers during the 1930s, gets the commission to redesign the New York Central Railroad, right? And so you can see, right, Loewy is working for a different railroad, Dreyfuss is working for this railroad, but they're all competing. They're all trying to suggest that their product is the most modern, up-to-date, stylish way to get from one place to another. So Dreyfuss redesigns the locomotive for the New York Central Railroad. In some ways, the streamlining has to do with the performance of the locomotive, but this is really a style that is being embraced, not only on the exterior and sort of like the business of the train, but on the interior, right, in the fittings and the furnishings inside the cars as well. And it also becomes attached to completely unrelated objects. So for example, Dreyfuss goes on, and this is from about a decade later, to design an iron for GE. Okay. Now I'm not saying that these are an exact match because they aren't, but he's really trying to make the iron look powerful, strong, speedy, and made out of the latest up-to-date materials. So you can see this as an example of product styling, right? That what he's really doing is not changing the iron in any way. He's changing the way the iron looks to make it more desirable to consumers. And again, manufacturers and designers around the U.S. Did this with their irons. And of course, maybe this makes us think that people used to iron things, which they did. So you can see all these irons here on the shelf of a collector, which just gives you a sense of the range, right? But also the similarities, right? They're all trying to emphasize the same qualities of the iron. And if you think about it, an iron really doesn't move at any speed, right? So it doesn't really require any kind of streamlining. This is really just making us think that this iron is better because it has visual characteristics that are prized. So what starts to happen, and one of the industries you can really see this in is actually the U.S. automobile industry, is that in order to stay competitive, in order to keep selling new cars every year, the automobile manufacturers start to introduce changes that have nothing really to do with the performance of the car. They're really cosmetic changes, and they relate to the visual vocabularies of the car. And you can see the dates here on the slide. GM actually created their what they called their art and color department in 1927. And a decade later, this was reorganized and expanded, sorry for the typo there, reorganized and expanded into what they called the styling department. Okay, so I've posted chapter 13 from the textbook for those of you who don't have the textbook to read. This talks all about this issue and how it was really in the 1920s and 1930s that manufacturers began to embrace industrial design, not to create products, but to create cosmetic alterations in products. That was really what they were after. They were not doing deep redesigns in terms of performance or features. What they were doing was introducing changes in color or in how exaggerately long the body was, or how compact, or what the taillights looked like, things like that, to make cars essentially go out of style. And Harley Earl, who was closely associated with GM and helped them do this for decades, called this dynamic obsolescence. So making things go out of fashion by introducing new fashions. So product styling very much has to do with fashion cycles. And of course, the fashion cycles have only gotten faster and more head-spinningly rapid since Harley Earl was working. But that idea of altering the surface of a product, essentially, the styling, is something that product designers, that's essentially what their job was throughout most of the rest of the 20th century in the United States. It was to make these sort of minor incremental changes that over time would add up to, oh gosh, I need to buy a new car. Even though my old one isn't really worn out, it looks old. Okay, so just as an aside, I would describe a Tesla as, the work that has gone into a Tesla as design, not product styling, right? If you look at this, this is an early Model S Tesla, whatever about the styling, but who cares, because actually this is an electric car, right? So there is an advance here. There is an actual value added. It's not about the color or the finish on the paint or the way the mirrors look. It is actually an entirely different type of motor. Okay, so just to sort of go through this one more time, design, let's say, is something made through this process of careful consideration, right? So it's going to have functional ideas in mind. It's also going to have an aesthetic appeal. Styling really subtracts out the functional changes. It's really just about sort of tweaking the aesthetics to make something more appealing and to change it. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples. Now, these may in fact be really different chocolates, but we're actually going to be purchasing this not based on a taste test, right? But based on a visual of packaging. So I actually think packaging design is a really great place to think about product styling and how effective it is. So I'm going to click through these now. You can go back and look through these slides later and really think about the packaging design here. They're using very different visual vocabularies to market these different chocolates. Okay, so this is the first one. This is another one. So here you can see they're using a different aesthetic to market this chocolate. This has yet another aesthetic going on in it. These have a different packaging scheme. I'm kind of a modernist, so I've put a lot of modern ones in here. So we're picking these, right, if at the grocery store as we check out, based upon the visual characteristics of the packaging, rather than on, well, which one is better, and not on, well, is this chocolate produced through fair trade that enables the producers to make a living, right? So that is another element that's going to kind of come into play here in the end of the course. So we can get really creative and make chocolate in a tube, right? But this chocolate could really have much the same characteristics as any of these other ones. Water is such a good place to see this, right? Because yes, there may be quality differences in these various waters, although tap water almost always ends up winning taste tests versus bottled water. And tap water, you at least know, has a certain degree of purity. So if you think about bottled water, people are using all kinds of different strategies in their packaging. So one of those is color, one of those is shape, clarity is often used in water bottles, but these are all essentially what we could think of as product styling, right? These are ways of making the product seem like it's very differentiated. Pricing the water really, really high is one way to create a market niche. But in terms of actual design, these very ordinary, boring looking bottles are at least made with 50% post-consumer plastic. Now, I don't know if this is really a huge win in that we shouldn't be using single-use plastics at all, but these bottles are, more sustainable than any of these competitors. What's in them is probably all pretty similar. Okay, so where this problem of product styling brings us is that design gets a reputation for making these cosmetic changes that have to do with fashion cycles, pushing us into overconsumption, right? So things go out of function long before they actually lose their use value. So design starts to seem almost like part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And I want to talk about sort of two answers to that, both of which we're going to be exploring in the next part of the class. So one thing is to point out that we actually do need good product design, and we have many products that perform badly. So John Heskett, who is a very well-known design author, has put it this way. He says, very few aspects of our material environment are incapable of improvement in some significant way by greater attention being paid to their design. So what he's saying is, actually, we have all kinds of things that don't work well. And I'm sure if you take a second and start to think of a few, you can probably come up with a few of your own examples of things that really don't function the way they should. So one huge thing in packaging design is overpackaged stuff that is really where it's actually physically difficult to remove the packaging. Heskett actually talks about lighting that's inadequate in a given location, machines that are not user-friendly, that make it really hard to do what you're trying to do in a simple way, information that is badly formatted. So information that essentially where the most important information is the least visible. And he says, these are all examples of bad design. So what he's essentially saying is there's plenty of room for product designers to actually make products that function well and that make people happy. So if you think about people talking about certain pieces of design that they love or appreciate, right? They often have a lot of affection for objects that work well, that work as they're supposed to, that make life easier. Okay, so this is the sort of aspect that we're going to be talking about in the coming week using the Don Norman book, The Design of Everyday Things, where he's really talking about what is bad design, why is it that we have so much of it, and how do we get better design. But the other major angle on this is to say that what we don't really need is products at all. And this should remind you of the readings that you were discussing last week, right? This sort of movement from design as being primarily about the making of visual information or the making of objects, some kind of product, like a watch, for example, or a can opener, right? Or a refrigerator, or sneaker, whatever it is. The movement away from thinking of design primarily as a way of making more objects to thinking about design in a much broader, expanded notion of design, which has to do with using it as a way of thinking and using it as a way of thinking about difficult problems. So the idea is somehow to bring the sort of ingenuity and the problem-solving ability of design to bear on real-world problems, right? So not how do we design a sexier looking designer water bottle, right? But how do we actually provide clean water in a community that doesn't have any, right? Or how do we transport people across this distance safely? Or how do we provide more food security in a city? How do we reduce carbon emissions in a given community, right? These kinds of questions. So this is another major theme that we're going to be exploring in the next couple of weeks, is this idea, and it has many different names. Social design, I think, is actually sort of a good one, because what it suggests is a kind of pro-social agenda. How do we make the world better? We don't necessarily need, it could be a thing, right? So for example, there are fairly incredible projects going on right now about providing sanitary facilities like bathrooms in places that don't have them. Also providing menstrual products to people who don't have them. So it can be a thing like a porta potty or a menstrual cup, but it could be something much more intangible than that. So we're really going to be talking about this a lot more. This is just sort of a preview, I guess, of coming attractions. The work that I want you guys to do in this module is